He looked at his trembling wife across the courtroom and smirked. Richard Sterling, the city's most ruthless litigator, had stripped her of her bank accounts, her home, and her dignity. He knew she couldn't afford a public defender, let alone a shark like him. When the judge asked Mrs. Sterling, "Where is your counsel?" Richard actually laughed out loud. He leaned over and whispered, "Game over, darling." But then the heavy oak doors at the back of the room creaked open. The room went silent. And when Richard saw who walked through those doors, the blood drained from his face. He thought he had won until he realized who he was actually up against. The silence in the Sterling household was usually the kind you found in museums, pristine, expensive, and terrifying to touch. But today the silence was shattered by the sound of a zipper tearing shut. Sarah Sterling stood in the center of the master bedroom, her hands trembling as she packed a small duffel bag. She wasn't packing clothes for a vacation. She was packing the few things Richard hadn't technically paid for. That amounted to 3 t-shirts, a pair of worn jeans from her college days, and a framed photograph of her father. You realize how pathetic this looks, don't you? Sarah froze. Richard was leaning against the doorframe, swirling a glass of scotch, though it was barely noon on a Tuesday. He was wearing his charcoal Armani suit, the one he wore when he was about to destroy someone in a deposition. He looked immaculate. He looked like a predator. "I'm leaving Richard," Sarah whispered, not daring to meet his eyes. "I can't do this anymore. The gaslighting, the control. I'm done." Richard threw his head back and laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a dry, sharp bark. "You're done, Sarah. Look around you. You live in a $4 million brownstone in Chicago's Gold Coast. You haven't worked a day in 7 years. You don't have a resume. You don't have a savings account. You don't even have a credit card that I don't monitor." He walked over the ice, clinking in his glass, and loomed over her. He was 6'2", broad-shouldered, and smelled of sandalwood and intimidation. "I filed the papers this morning," Richard said casually, taking a sip. "Incompatibility. But here's the kicker. Sweetheart, I've frozen the joint accounts. Pending litigation, of course. Standard procedure to prevent dissipation of assets. You have exactly $42 in your purse. I checked." Sarah's stomach dropped. "You can't do that. I need to eat. I need a place to stay." "Then you shouldn't have threatened to leave me." He hissed, his face suddenly inches from hers. "You think you can walk out on Richard Sterling? I am a senior partner at Verify and Halloway. I eat other lawyers for breakfast. Who are you going to hire to represent you? Who?" Sarah bit her lip to keep from crying. He was right. He knew everyone, every judge, every firm, every clerk in Cook County. He had connections that went back generations. She was just Sarah from Ohio, the quiet girl he'd swept off her feet at a charity gala, the one he'd molded into the perfect silent housewife. "I'll find someone," she managed to say, zipping the bag. "You won't," Richard smirked. "I've already conflicted out the top 10 firms in the city. I had consultations with all of them last week. They can't touch you. And a public defender. Please. This is civil court, darling. You don't get a free lawyer here." He reached out and patted her cheek, a gesture that was patronizing and possessive all at once. "Go run to your mother. Oh, wait. She lives in that tumble-down shack in the middle of nowhere, doesn't she? What's she going to do? Bake me a pie?" Sarah slapped his hand away. The sound echoed in the room. Richard's eyes went cold. "Get out, before I call security and have you removed for trespassing." Sarah grabbed her bag and ran. She didn't stop until she was 3 blocks away, hyperventilating on a park bench near the lakefront. The wind was biting, cutting through her thin coat. She pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking so hard, she dropped it twice before dialing the number. It rang. And rang. "Hello." A voice crackled on the other end. It sounded tired, worn down by years of hard living. "Mom." Sarah choked out, the tears finally spilling over. "Mom, he did it. He threw me out. He froze everything. He says I can't get a lawyer. He says he's going to crush me." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Margaret Harrington. Sarah's mother had always been a mystery to her neighbors. She lived a quiet life in rural Ohio, gardening and reading heavy books. To Richard, she was a peasant, a nobody. "Sarah," Margaret's voice shifted. The tiredness evaporated. The tone dropped an octave, becoming steel-hard. "Did he threaten you?" "He said he'd ruin me. He said no one in Chicago would represent me." "Did he now?" Margaret said softly. Richard always was a loud boy, all bark and expensive suits. "Mom, what do? I have $40. I'm scared." "Dry your tears, Sarah. Do you hear me? Stand up straight." Sarah sniffled, wiping her eyes instinctively, straightening her spine, even though her mother couldn't see her. "Okay, I'm standing." "Good. You find a motel. The cheapest one you can find. I'm transferring $500 to that old emergency account we made when you were in college, the one he doesn't know about. It's not much, but it will get you through the week." "But the court hearing is in 3 days," Sarah cried. "He filed for an emergency motion to secure the house. If I don't have a lawyer, he gets everything by default." "You don't need a lawyer from Chicago, Sarah," Margaret said. "I'll be there." Sarah blinked. Mum, you can't come here. You hate the city. And what can you do? Richard will eat you alive." He mocked you, Mum. He said you'd just bake him a pie." On the other end of the line, Margaret Harrington let out a short, terrifying chuckle. "A pie," Margaret mused. "Well, I suppose I will be serving him something, but it won't be dessert. I'll see you in 2 days, Sarah. Don't say a word to him. Not one word." The line went dead. Sarah stared at the phone. She had never heard her mother sound like that. For as long as she could remember, Margaret had been a soft-spoken widow who grew hydrangeas. But for a split second, the woman on the phone hadn't sounded like a gardener. She sounded like a general. The Cook County Courthouse was a fortress of gray stone and misery. Tuesday morning brought a sleet storm that battered the windows, matching the mood inside courtroom 402. Sarah sat at the defendant's table. She looked small. She was wearing a simple navy dress she had bought at a thrift store the day before, because all her court-appropriate clothes were locked in the brownstone. Her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. To her right, the plaintiff's table was a spectacle of wealth. Richard sat there, looking like the king of the world. He was flanked by 2 junior associates, both scribbling furiously on legal pads. A paralegal was arranging stacks of binders. Richard wasn't even looking at Sarah. He was checking his watch, looking bored. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. Judge Anthony Russo swept into the room. Russo was known as the Bull. He was impatient, loud, and had zero tolerance for wasting time. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and looked at the docket. "Sterling versus Sterling," Judge Russo grunted. "Emergency motion for exclusive possession of the marital residence and temporary freezing of assets. We are also here for the preliminary hearing on the dissolution of marriage." Good morning, Your Honor. Richard stood up, buttoning his jacket smoothly. Richard Sterling, representing myself pro se, though as you know I am a partner at Sterling, Myers and Holt. I know who you are, Mr. Sterling, Rousseau said, waving a hand. Let's get on with it. The judge turned his gaze to the empty chair next to Sarah. He frowned. Mrs. Sterling, Rousseau boomed. Where is your counsel? Sarah stood up, her legs shaking. I don't have one, Your Honor. Richard let out a loud, theatrical sigh. He turned to the judge, spreading his hands in mock sympathy. Your Honor, I warned my wife repeatedly to secure counsel. I even offered to provide a list of names. It seems she is not taking these proceedings seriously. This is a waste of the court's time. Is that true, Mrs. Sterling? Rousseau asked, his eyes narrowing. You've had 3 days' notice. In a case involving assets of this magnitude, appearing pro se is ill-advised. I couldn't afford one, Your Honor. Sarah stammered. Richard froze the accounts. A standard protective measure, Your Honor, Richard interjected smoothly. My wife has a history of impulsive spending. I was protecting the marital estate. It was a lie. Sarah had never spent impulsively in her life. She opened her mouth to object, but Richard rolled right over her. Your Honor, since the defendant is unprepared and unrepresented, I move for a default judgment on the motion for exclusive possession. She clearly has no defense. Judge Rousseau looked at the clock. He had a golf game at 3. Mrs. Sterling, if you have no lawyer, I have no choice but to proceed. You are expected to know the rules of evidence and procedure if you represent yourself. Are you prepared to argue against Mr. Sterling's motion right now? Sarah looked around the room frantically. The back doors were closed. The gallery was mostly empty, save for a few law students observing the great Richard Sterling at work. Her mother wasn't there. Mom, she whispered to herself. Where are you? Mrs. Sterling, the judge barked. I am expecting someone, Your Honor, Sarah said, her voice trembling. My mother. She said she was coming to help. Richard laughed. It was a sharp, cruel sound that cut through the courtroom. Your Honor. Richard chuckled, shaking his head. With all due respect, unless Mrs. Sterling's mother is a member of the Illinois Bar, I fail to see how her presence is relevant. This isn't a parent-teacher conference. This is a court of law. I ask that you rule on the motion. The young law students in the back snickered. Sarah felt her face burning. She was humiliated, totally and completely alone. The court is inclined to agree, Judge Rousseau said, picking up his gavel. Mrs. Sterling, this is unfortunate, but the law is the law. You have failed to secure counsel. Mr. Sterling has presented a prima facie case for... Bam! The double doors at the back of the courtroom didn't just open. They were thrown open with such force that they banged against the wood paneling. The entire room jumped. Judge Rousseau dropped his gavel. Richard spun around, annoyed. Who in the hell is making that racket? Judge Rousseau shouted. Standing in the doorway was a woman. She was older, perhaps in her late 60s, wearing a tweed coat that looked like it had seen better days and a rain hat. She was soaking wet from the storm. She carried a battered leather briefcase that looked like it was from the 1970s. It was Margaret. She looked small in the massive doorway. Richard scanned her, took in the cheap coat and the wet shoes, and smirked. He turned back to the judge. Apologies, Your Honor, Richard said dismissively. That appears to be the mother in question, Mrs. Harrington. I suppose she's here to hold my wife's hand. Margaret didn't say a word. She began to walk down the center aisle. She didn't walk like an old woman with bad knees. She walked with a rhythmic, predatory cadence. Click, click, click. The sound of her sensible heels echoed on the marble floor. She reached the gate, the swinging wooden barrier that separates the public from the attorneys. "Ma'am." The bailiff stepped forward, putting a hand on his belt. "You can't pass the bar. That area is for attorneys and parties only. Take a seat in the gallery." Margaret stopped. She looked at the bailiff. Then slowly she reached up and removed her rain hat. Her hair was steel grey, pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense bun. Her eyes were like blue lasers. She looked at Richard. "Richard," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the room. "You always did have a problem with premature celebration." "Sit down, Maggie," Richard sneered. "You're embarrassing, Srora." Margaret turned her gaze to Judge Rousseau. She ignored the bailiff entirely and pushed the gate open. "Order!" Rousseau shouted, his face turning red. "Madame, you will step back behind the bar immediately, or I will hold you in contempt. Who do you think you are?" Margaret walked straight to the defense table. She dropped her heavy, battered briefcase onto the mahogany table with a loud thud. It sounded like a gunshot. She looked up at the judge, her eyes showing zero fear. In fact, she looked bored. "My name," she said, her voice clear and crisp, "is Margaret Harrington, and I am entering my appearance as counsel for the defendant, Sarah Sterling." Richard burst out laughing. "You counsel, Your Honor, this is a joke. My mother-in-law is a retired school librarian from Ohio. She is not a lawyer. This is making a mockery of your court." Judge Rousseau looked down at Margaret with disdain. "Mrs. Harrington, practicing law without a license is a felony. Do you have a license to practice in the state of Illinois?" Margaret slowly unbuttoned her tweed coat. Underneath, she wasn't wearing a librarian's cardigan. She was wearing a tailored black suit. It was old-fashioned, yes, but the cut was impeccable. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a single, crisp piece of paper. "I do not have an active Illinois license, Your Honor," Margaret said calmly. "Then get it out." Rousseau pointed his gavel. "However," Margaret continued, her voice cutting through the judge's command, "I have here a motion for admission, pro hac vice, sponsored by the Illinois Supreme Court under the Reciprocity Act of 1998. And if you check your clerk's database, you will find that while my Illinois license has been inactive for 25 years, I am currently a member in good standing of the Bar of New York, the Bar of Washington, D.C. And," she paused, looking Richard dead in the eye, "and I am the sole emeritus partner of the firm, Harrington, Vance and Keene." The room went dead silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop. Richard's smirk vanished. His face went grey. "Harrington. Vance?" he whispered. "Wait. The Harrington. You never did ask what my maiden name was, Richard," Margaret said, opening her briefcase and pulling out a stack of files thick enough to choke a horse. "You were always too busy talking about yourself." She turned to the judge, who was now staring at her with his mouth slightly open. "Now, Your Honor," Margaret said, putting on a pair of reading glasses. "I believe the plaintiff was just moving for a default judgment based on a lack of representation. Since that is no longer the case, I would like to address the motion to freeze assets. And I have a few counter-motions of my own. 17 of them, to be exact." She smiled. It was a terrifying smile. "Shall we begin?" The silence in courtroom 402 was heavy, the kind that precedes a natural disaster. Judge Rousseau stared at the documents Margaret had placed on his bench. He adjusted his glasses, squinting at the embossed seal of the New York State Bar Association. "Mrs. Harrington," Judge Russo said, his voice losing its thunderous edge and replaced by a cautious curiosity. "You are that Margaret Harrington, the one who argued United States v. O'Connell before the Supreme Court in '89. Margaret didn't smile. She simply inclined her head. "I was, though back then I had better hair and less patience for bullies." Richard Sterling stood up, his face a mask of strained politeness. "Your Honor, this is fascinating history, truly. But with all due respect to my mother-in-law's ancient accolades, she has been a housewife in rural Ohio for 2 decades. The law changes. Procedural rules in Cook County are specific. She is not competent to try a complex asset division case in 2026. He turned to Sarah, flashing a pitying look. "Sarah, darling, this is a mistake. Don't let her drag you down. Let's settle this quietly." Margaret stepped in front of Sarah, blocking Richard's view. She didn't look at Richard. She kept her eyes fixed on the judge. "Your Honor," Margaret said, her voice crisp, "Mr. Sterling raises a point about competence. Let's test it. He filed an emergency motion to freeze assets based on dissipation risk. Under Illinois Statute 750, ILCS 5501, he must prove that my client has actually attempted to hide or destroy assets. His affidavit cites," she glanced at a paper in her hand without needing to read it, "a withdrawal of $200 from an ATM as proof of reckless spending." She dropped the paper on the table. "Meanwhile," Margaret continued, her volume rising slightly, "I have here a printout from the Cook County Recorder of Deeds, accessed 10 minutes ago on my phone in the hallway. It shows that yesterday afternoon, after filing for divorce, but before serving my client, Mr. Sterling transferred the deed of the marital vacation home in Lake Geneva to a limited liability company named R.S. Holdings. That, Your Honor, is a textbook fraudulent transfer designed to defraud the marital estate." Richard froze. The color drained from his face. That was a business transaction planned months ago. It has nothing to do with the divorce." "Is that so?" Margaret challenged, pivoting to face him. "Then why is the registered agent for R.S. Holdings listed as T. Miller, your college roommate and current fraternity brother?" Judge Russo's eyes narrowed. He looked at Richard. The bull did not like being played in his own courtroom. "Mr. Sterling," the judge growled, "did you transfer real estate assets yesterday?" "Your Honor, I can explain," Richard stammered. "Save it," Russo snapped. He slammed his gavel. "Motion to freeze Mrs. Sterling's access to funds is denied. Furthermore, I am granting the defense's oral motion for temporary maintenance. You will unfreeze the joint accounts immediately, and Mr. Sterling, if you move one more dime without this court's permission, I will hold you in contempt so fast your head will spin. We reconvene in 3 weeks for discovery." "3 weeks?" Richard protested. "I need more time to prepare the financial disclosures." "Mrs. Harrington seems to have found your property records in 10 minutes using a smartphone counselor," Russo said dryly. "I expect a partner at a top firm can match her speed." Court adjourned. As the bailiff called "All rise," Richard shoveled his papers into his briefcase, his composure shattering. He leaned across the aisle as the judge exited. "You think this is a win?" Richard hissed at Margaret. "You just woke up a sleeping giant, Maggie. I'm going to bury you in paper. I'm going to make this the most expensive, painful divorce in Chicago history." Margaret calmly began packing her battered briefcase. She snapped the latches shut, click, click, and looked him up and down. "Richard," she said softly, "you mistake me for someone who cares about your threats. You see, I retired because I was tired of winning. I thought gardening would be a challenge. She paused, her eyes turning to ice. But destroying you. That sounds like a pleasant hobby. She took Sarah's arm. Come along, Sarah. We have work to do. They walked out of the courtroom, leaving Richard Sterling, standing alone, gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. Outside in the corridor, away from the prying eyes of the law students and clerks, Sarah finally collapsed. Her legs gave out, and she slid down the marble wall, burying her face in her hands. I can't believe it, she sobbed. I really thought it was over. Mum, who are you? Why didn't you tell me? Margaret sighed, the steel facade melting away to reveal the tired mother underneath. She sat down on the cold floor, next to her daughter, ignoring the dirt on her expensive suit. I didn't tell you because I wanted to leave that life behind, Sarah, Margaret said gently, wrapping an arm around her daughter's shoulders. Your father, he was a good man, but he hated the law. He hated what it turned me into. When he got sick, I promised him I'd put down the sword. I wanted you to know me as a mother, not as the Harrington Hammer. Sarah looked up, her eyes red. The Harrington Hammer. It was a nickname. Margaret gave a small, wry smile. Unflattering but accurate. I was ruthless, Sarah. I defended corporations. I crushed unions. I destroyed good people because the law was on my side. I didn't like who I was, so I quit. I moved to the farm to find some peace. She reached out and brushed a stray hair from Sarah's face. But when you called me, when I heard the fear in your voice, I realized something. Peace is a luxury. Protecting your child is a duty. I picked up the sword again, Sarah, and I promise you I'm not putting it down until you are safe. Sarah hugged her mother tight, weeping into the tweed coat. For the first time in 7 years, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt like she had an army. Now, Margaret said, standing up and dusting herself off. Enough crying. Richard is going to try to intimidate us. We need a war room. The Motel 6 won't do. It's all I can afford, Sarah said. Sarah. Margaret opened her purse and pulled out a black credit card. A Centurion card, the kind made of titanium that you have to be invited to own. I said I retired. I didn't say I was broke. We're checking into the peninsula. I need room service and high-speed internet. We're going hunting. The war room was a suite on the 15th floor of the Peninsula Hotel overlooking the magnificent Mile. It was filled with the smell of stale coffee and printer toner. 3 days had passed since the hearing. True to his threat, Richard had initiated scorched earth tactics. He sent it, Sarah said, staring at the hotel room door. A delivery crew had just dropped off 45 bankers' boxes of documents. They were stacked floor to ceiling, blocking the view of the TV. The discovery dump, Margaret said, walking over to inspect the boxes. She was wearing a silk robe, a pencil in her hair, looking more energized than she had in years. Oldest trick in the book. He's legally required to give us his financial records, so he's giving us everything. Every receipt, every email, every junk flyer, mixed in with the actual bank statements. He wants to bury the needle in the haystack. Sarah opened the first box. It was full of Richard's dry cleaning receipts from 2018. Mum, this is impossible. There are 50,000 pages here. We can't read all this in 2 weeks. We don't have to read all of it, Margaret said, eyes gleaming. We just have to know what we're looking for. Richard is arrogant, Sarah. Arrogant men are sloppy. They think they're smarter than everyone else, so they don't hide things deep enough. They hide them in plain sight. Margaret walked over to the desk where she had set up 3 laptops. She had called in a few favors from her old life. She didn't have a firm anymore, but she had former paralegals who owed her their careers. 2 of them were currently working remotely from New York, scanning the digitized files Margaret was uploading. "What are we looking for?" Sarah asked, picking up a stack of papers. "Patterns," Margaret said. "Richard makes a lot of money. 7 figures. But he spends a lot, too. The brownstone, the cars, the suits. But there's a gap. I did a rough calculation of his billable hours versus his declared income. There's about $300,000 a year missing." "Maybe he gambles," Sarah suggested. "No. Richard hates losing money. He steals it or he hides it." Margaret tapped the screen. "I've been looking at his credit card statements. Look at this." Sarah squinted at the spreadsheet. A recurring charge. C&L Consulting. $5,000 every month. Exactly. It's marked as professional development in his business ledger. Tax deductible. But look at the dates. He pays them on the 15th of every month, even when we were on vacation in Italy last year. Even on holidays. Who are they? That's the question. I ran a search. C&L Consulting doesn't have a website. Their registered address is a P.O. box in a strip mall in Cicero. Margaret took a sip of cold coffee. "That's not a consultant, Sarah. That's a person." Suddenly the hotel room phone rang. Margaret gestured for Sarah to wait, then picked it up. "Hello. Mrs. Harrington." The voice was deep, distorted. "You should stop digging. Chicago isn't safe for old ladies." Click. Margaret hung up the phone slowly. Her expression didn't change, but her jaw tightened. "Who was it?" Sarah asked, frightened. "A coward," Margaret said. "Richard is getting nervous. He knows we're close to something. Mum, maybe we should stop. If he's hiring people to threaten us." Margaret slammed her hand on the desk. "No, that is exactly what he wants. Fear is his currency, Sarah. He spent 7 years buying your silence with it. He is not buying mine." She turned back to the boxes. "Grab box number 12. Look for anything related to C&L, or anything with the initials CL. We aren't sleeping tonight." They worked through the night. The luxury of the hotel suite faded into a blur of paper cuts and eye strain. By 4:00 a.m., Sarah was dozing off on the floor, surrounded by invoices. Margaret was still awake, pacing the room. She was holding a single piece of paper she had found in the bottom of box 33. It wasn't a financial document. It was a handwritten note scribbled on a napkin, stapled to a receipt for a diamond bracelet. A bracelet Sarah had never received. The note read, "Thanks for the bailout. R. loves C." Margaret woke Sarah up. "Sarah, wake up. Who is C?" Sarah rubbed her eyes, looking at the note. She frowned. "I don't know. His friends are all men. Tom, David, Mike. There's no C. Think. A secretary, a paralegal, a client." Sarah shook her head. Then she paused. A memory surfaced. A dinner party 3 years ago. Richard had been overly solicitous to the wife of one of his biggest clients. No, that was a J. Wait. There was a nanny, Sarah whispered, for his partner's kids. We went to a barbecue at the Halloway house. There was a young woman, very pretty, roughly 25. She was studying law. Richard spent the whole afternoon talking to her about mentorship. "What was her name?" Margaret asked intensely. "Cassidy," Sarah said. "Cassidy Lane." C&L, Margaret said. Cassidy Lane Consulting. Margaret rushed to the computer. She typed furiously. Cassidy Lane, Illinois Bar Association. Here she is. Admitted to the bar last year. Current employment. Unknown. Margaret pulled up a map. She typed in the address of the strip mall in Cicero. Then she cross-referenced it with property records. Bingo, Margaret whispered. What is it? The strip mall isn't just a P.O. box, Margaret said. The building is owned by Blue Heron LLC, and Blue Heron LLC is owned by Richard Sterling. Sarah gasped. He's paying rent to himself. No. Margaret shook her head. He's paying her. He set up a shell company to funnel money to her. He's keeping her Sarah. But it's worse than an affair. $5,000 a month is hush money, or support. Margaret looked at the date on the first check to C&L. 3 years ago. Sarah. Was that barbecue 3 years ago? Yes. And did anything happen around that time? Anything unusual with Richard? Sarah thought back. The memories of that time were a blur of depression and isolation. He went away for a week. He said it was a conference in Denver. But when he came back, he was different, jumpier. He made me sign a post-nuptial agreement that week. He said if I didn't sign it, he'd divorce me and leave me with nothing. And you signed it. I was scared. I signed it. Margaret's eyes narrowed. He panicked. Something happened with Cassidy Lane that week, and he needed to lock down his assets immediately. Margaret picked up her phone. It was 5:00 a.m. Who are you calling? Sarah asked. A private investigator I used to work with. He's expensive, he drinks too much, and he has zero morals. He's perfect. Margaret dialed. We need to find Cassidy Lane, and we need to find out what Richard is paying her to hide. Because I have a feeling, Sarah, that this isn't just about cheating. This is about a crime. The sun began to rise over Lake Michigan, casting a pale light into the room. The boxes of paper no longer looked like a barrier. They looked like a road map. Get dressed, Sarah, Margaret said. Her voice filled with a cold, terrifying resolve. We have a deposition at 9:00 a.m. Richard thinks he's going to intimidate us with his legal jargon. But today, I'm going to ask him about Cassidy. And we are going to watch him bleed. The deposition took place in the main conference room of Sterling, Myers and Holt. It was a room designed to intimidate, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline and a table long enough to land a plane on. Richard sat at the head of the table, flanked by his legal team. He looked rested, confident, and utterly dismissive of the two women sitting opposite him. Margaret was wearing her reading glasses on a chain, slowly organizing her files with maddening slowness. Mrs. Harrington. Richard checked his watch. We've been here for 20 minutes, and you haven't asked a single question. If you're trying to run out the clock, I'll bill you for my time. Margaret looked up, smiling sweetly. Oh, I'm just admiring the view, Richard. It's amazing how small everything looks from up here, even the people. She signaled the court reporter to begin. Mr. Sterling. Margaret began, her voice monotone. State your full name and occupation. Richard James Sterling, senior partner. Margaret spent the next hour asking incredibly boring, minute questions about his dry cleaning bills, his golf club memberships, and his car lease payments. Richard grew visibly relaxed, bordering on bored. He answered with sarcastic quips, rolling his eyes at his associates. He thought the Harrington hammer had lost her edge. He thought she was just a nitpicking old woman. And this charge on November the 12th? Margaret asked, looking at a receipt. $400 at the prime rib. Was that business or personal? Business, Richard sighed. client dinner. I see. Margaret shuffled her papers. And the charge on November 14th to C&L Consulting, $5,000. Richard didn't flinch. He had practiced this. Business. External jury consultant. $5,000, Margaret repeated, for a jury consultant. That's a standard rate. And what specific case did C&L consult on in November? The Peterson merger. Richard lied smoothly. They advised on public perception. Interesting, Margaret said. She reached into her folder. Because I called the Peterson legal team this morning. They said they've never heard of C&L Consulting. In fact, they said you handled the public perception personally. Richard stiffened. I subcontracted it. It's privileged work product. Of course, Margaret said. She pulled out another photo. It was a grainy picture taken by her private investigator just yesterday. It showed a young woman pushing a stroller into a pediatrician's office. Is this the consultant? Margaret asked, sliding the photo across the polished mahogany. Richard looked at the photo. His eyes widened imperceptibly, but his jaw clenched so hard a muscle popped in his cheek. I don't know who that is, Richard said coldly. Really? Margaret feigned surprise. Because that is Cassidy Lane, your former intern, and the recipient of the C&L checks, and that baby in the stroller. He has your nose, Richard. The room went deathly silent. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys. Richard's associates looked at each other uncomfortable. Objection, Richard's junior lawyer squeaked. Relevance. Harassment. It is highly relevant. Margaret's voice turned into a whip crack. She leaned forward, the old lady mask vanishing instantly. You are claiming poverty in this divorce, Mr. Sterling. You claim you cannot afford spousal support. Yet you are paying $60,000 a year to a woman you claim not to know to support a child you haven't disclosed to the court. That is perjury. That is fraud. Richard stood up, slamming his hands on the table. This deposition is over. You are fishing. You are slanderous. Sit down, Richard, Margaret barked. It was the voice that had commanded the Supreme Court. Richard actually flinched. I'm not fishing, Margaret said, her eyes boring into him. I am hunting, and I know why you're paying her. It's not just child support, is it? It's silence. Because you're on the short list for the federal appellate court vacancy, and a secret, illegitimate child with a subordinate 20 years your junior. Well, that doesn't look good on a background check, does it? Richard's face turned a violent shade of red. He looked at the court reporter. Stop typing. Everything said here is off the record. We are asserting privilege. You can't assert privilege over your own fraud, Margaret said calmly. And we aren't done. We know she's sick, Richard. This time Richard looked genuinely shocked. What? The baby, Margaret said softly. The boy, Leo, he has a congenital heart defect. My investigator found the medical bills in Cassidy's trash. That's why she needs the money. That's why she hasn't gone public. You're holding her son's healthcare hostage to keep your reputation clean. Sarah, sitting next to her mother, gasped. She looked at the man she had married. She knew he was cold. She knew he was cruel. But this, using a sick child as leverage. You monster, Sarah whispered. Richard gathered his files, his hands shaking with rage. Get out. Both of you. Get out of my building. You have no proof, just the ramblings of a stalker. If you try to bring that girl into court, I will bury her. I will make sure she never works in this state again. And I will make sure that kid ends up in state care. He pointed a finger at Sarah. And you. You will end up with nothing. I will burn every dollar I have before I give it to you." He stormed out of the conference room. Sarah sat there trembling. "Mom, is it true? Does he have a son?" Margaret packed the photo away carefully. Her face was grim. "Yes, and Richard just made a fatal mistake." "What?" "He threatened the mother," Margaret said. "He thinks Cassidy Lane is just a liability on a balance sheet. He forgot that she's a mother with a sick child, and a mother in a corner is the most dangerous creature on earth." Margaret pulled out her phone. "Come on, we have to get to Cicero before Richard's fixers do. He's going to try to buy her off or scare her into running." The rain had returned, turning the streets of Cicero into grey rivers. Cassidy Lane lived in a garden apartment unit below a laundromat. It was a far cry from the Gold Coast brownstone Sarah had lived in, but it was clean. Margaret parked the rental car, a nondescript Ford sedan, down the street. "Stay here, Sarah," Margaret said. "No," Sarah shook her head. "I need to see her. I need her to know I'm not the enemy." Margaret studied her daughter's face. She saw the new strength there. "All right, but let me do the talking initially." They walked to the door. Margaret knocked 3 times, firm but polite. No answer. "Cassidy," Margaret called out. "My name is Margaret Harrington. I'm Sarah Sterling's attorney. We know about Leo. We know about Richard." A shadow moved behind the curtain, then the sound of a deadbolt sliding back. The door opened a crack on the chain. A young woman peered out. She looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes' hair, in a messy bun, wearing a stained sweatshirt. But her eyes were sharp, intelligent. "He called me," Cassidy whispered, her voice shaking. "He said you were coming. He said you were crazy. He said if I talked to you, the checks stop. And if the checks stop, Leo doesn't get his surgery. He's lying, Cassidy." Sarah spoke up, stepping into the light. "He's going to stop the checks anyway. Once he gets his judgeship, he won't need you anymore. He'll find a way to make you disappear, legally." Cassidy looked at Sarah. There was a moment of recognition. 2 women who had been charmed, used, and discarded by the same man. "You're the wife," Cassidy said. "He told me you were crazy, that you were unstable." "He tells everyone that," Sarah said sadly. "Please, let us in. We can protect you. My mother, she can protect you." Cassidy hesitated, then unhooked the chain. "Quickly!" Inside the apartment was filled with baby toys and law textbooks. In the corner, a playpen held a sleeping toddler hooked up to a portable oxygen monitor. The rhythmic beep, beep was the only sound in the room. Margaret didn't waste time. She sat at the small kitchen table. "Cassidy, I'm going to be blunt. Richard is legally cornered. He threatened you today in a deposition. He is losing control. Men like Richard, when they lose control, they become dangerous." Cassidy wrapped her arms around herself. "He made me sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. It says if I ever mention his name, I owe him $1 million. I can't talk to you." "That NDA is void," Margaret said, her voice filled with authority. "An NDA cannot be used to cover up a crime or to avoid child support obligations. It is unenforceable as a matter of public policy. I can have it thrown out in 5 minutes." "But the money," Cassidy looked at her son. "Leo needs a valve replacement next month. It's $80,000 out of pocket because the insurance Richard got me is garbage." Margaret reached across the table and took Cassidy's hand. "If you testify, if you help us expose him, I will personally guarantee Leo's medical care. I have assets, Cassidy. Real assets. Not shell companies." Cassidy looked at Margaret, then at Sarah. Tears welled up in her eyes. "I wanted to be a lawyer," she sobbed. "I was top of my class. I interned for him. I thought he was a mentor. Then one night we were working late, and he just decided he owned me. And when I got pregnant, he told me he'd ruin my career if I kept it. But I couldn't. I couldn't get rid of Leo." Sarah moved to her and hugged her. It was a strange tableau, the wife and the mistress united by the wreckage of one man's ego. "He ruined us both," Sarah said. "But we can stop him." Cassidy wiped her eyes. She stood up and walked to a bookshelf. She pulled out a hollowed-out copy of Black's Law Dictionary. Inside was a small digital voice recorder. "I'm a lawyer too," Cassidy said, her voice hardening. "Or I was going to be. I knew who he was. I knew he would eventually turn on me. So I recorded him. Every time he came here to drop off cash, every time he threatened me." Margaret's eyes lit up. "You have him on tape. I have him admitting to the asset hiding," Cassidy said. "I have him admitting he bribed a clerk to delay your hearing dates, and I have him threatening to pull the plug on Leo if I didn't sign the NDA." Margaret took the recorder like it was a holy relic. "This is it," Margaret said. "This isn't just a divorce case anymore. This is a RICO case. This is disbarment. This is prison." Suddenly there was a loud banging on the front door. "Cassidy, open up!" A man's voice. Rough, aggressive. Cassidy froze. "It's his driver, the one who brings the cash. Open the door, or we kick it in." Margaret stood up. She picked up her phone and dialed 911. But then she paused. She looked at the door, then at Sarah and Cassidy. "Sarah, take the recorder," Margaret ordered. "Go into the bedroom with Cassidy and Leo. Lock the door. Mum, what are you going to do?" Margaret buttoned her tweed jacket. She walked to the kitchen drawer and picked up a rolling pin. It was ridiculous, yet somehow in her hands it looked like a gavel. "I'm going to teach Richard's goons a lesson about trespassing," Margaret said calmly. "And then we are going to court." Crash! The front door splintered open. Two men in leather jackets stepped in. They looked around, spotting the older woman in the kitchen. "Where is she?" the lead goon growled. Margaret Harrington didn't flinch. She raised her chin. "Gentlemen," she said, "you have exactly 3 seconds to leave before I ruin your lives. And trust me, I don't need a rolling pin to do it. I'm a lawyer." The goons hesitated. They expected a scared grandma. They didn't expect a woman who looked like she was waiting for a bus. "Grab her," the goon said. Margaret smiled. "Excellent. Assault on an officer of the court. Add it to the list." As the first man lunged, sirens wailed in the distance. Margaret hadn't just dialed 911. She had triggered the silent alarm on her Centurion card app, a feature for high-net-worth clients in distress. The flashing lights painted the room in red and blue. The goons froze. "Checkmate," Margaret whispered. The day of the final hearing, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread through the Chicago legal community that Richard Sterling, the man who never lost, was in a death match against his own mother-in-law. Richard arrived wearing a suit that cost more than most cars. He looked calm, almost bored. He didn't know about the raid in Cicero. He didn't know about the recorder. His goons had been arrested before they could call him, and Margaret had pulled strings to keep the police report sealed until this very moment. Sarah sat at the defense table. She wasn't shaking anymore. She wore a white suit, crisp and clean. She looked like a woman who had already survived the fire. "All rise," the bailiff called. Judge Russo took his seat. He looked tired. He looked at Richard, then at Margaret. We are here for the final arguments regarding the division of assets and the validity of the prenuptial agreement, Russo said. Mr. Sterling, you have the floor. Richard stood up. He walked to the center of the room, buttoning his jacket. He turned to the gallery, treating them like a jury. Your Honor, Richard began, his voice smooth as silk. This case is simple. My wife signed a prenuptial agreement. It is ironclad. She receives $50,000 and walks away. The defense has tried to muddy the waters with accusations of hidden school assets and conspiracy theories, but they have produced zero evidence, no bank accounts, no shell companies. He turned to Sarah, smiling cruelly. The truth is, Your Honor, my wife is mentally unstable. She is being manipulated by her mother, a woman who hasn't practiced law in decades and clearly has a vendetta against me. I am the victim here. I have supported this woman for 7 years, and now I just want my life back. He sat down to a murmur of approval from his associates. He had performed perfectly. Mrs. Harrington, Judge Russo asked. Margaret stood up. She didn't walk to the center. She stayed at the table, her hands resting on a small black speaker she had placed there. Your Honor, Margaret said quietly, Mr. Sterling is right about one thing. We did not find the bank accounts in his name. Richard smirked. We didn't find them. Margaret continued, her voice rising. Because they aren't in his name. They are in the name of a child Mr. Sterling has spent 3 years hiding. Richard's smirk faltered. Objection. We've been over this, no proof. The proof, Margaret said, is not on paper. It is here. She pressed play on the speaker. The sound was crystal clear. It filled the cavernous courtroom. You listen to me, Cassidy. You sign that NDA or I pull the plug. Do you hear me? I control the insurance. I control the doctors. You open your mouth, and Leo dies. I don't care about the kid. I care about the seat on the bench. I'm not letting a bastard child ruin my federal appointment. The voice was unmistakably Richard's. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a room where the oxygen had been sucked out. Richard stood up, his face white as a sheet. That is a deep fake. That is AI. I never said that. Margaret pressed play again. And as for my wife, Sarah is a pathetic, brainless trophy. I'll starve her out. I hid the money in the Blue Heron LLC. She'll never find it. She's too stupid to look in Cicero. The gallery gasped. Judge Russo's face went purple. He stared at Richard with a look of pure revulsion. Mr. Sterling, Judge Russo said, his voice dangerously low. Is that your voice? It's fabricated, Richard screamed, losing all composure. She's setting me up. Who gave you that? Who? I did. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Cassidy Lane walked in. She was pushing a stroller. She walked down the aisle, her head held high, staring straight at the man who had tormented her. I am the witness, Your Honor, Cassidy said clearly, and I have the original digital files time-stamped and verified. Richard looked at Cassidy, then at the judge, then at the door. For a second, he looked like he was going to run. But there were 2 bailiffs standing behind him now. Mr. Sterling, Judge Russo stood up. This court is hereby invalidating the prenuptial agreement on the grounds of fraud, duress, and unconscionability. Furthermore, I am referring this matter immediately to the state's attorney for criminal investigation regarding extortion, fraud, and child endangerment. Russo slammed his gavel so hard it cracked the wood. Bailiff, take Mr. Sterling into custody, pending a hearing on flight risk. I'm holding him in contempt. You can't do this, Richard shrieked as the bailiffs grabbed his arms. I am Richard Sterling. I own this town. Not anymore, Richard. Sarah spoke up. She stood looking down at him as he was handcuffed. You don't own anything. Not the money, not the house, and certainly not us. Richard was dragged out of the courtroom, kicking and screaming, stripping away the last veneer of his dignity. The gallery erupted into chaos. Reporters were shouting questions. Margaret slowly packed her briefcase. She looked at Sarah. Well, Margaret said, dusting off her hands. That went well. Sarah looked at her mother. Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of relief. She hugged Margaret, burying her face in the tweed coat that smelled of rain and justice. Thank you, Sarah whispered. You saved my life. I just gave you back the life you always had. Sarah. Margaret smiled, kissing her daughter's forehead. Now let's go. I believe I promised you a pie. And Cassidy. You and Leo are coming with us. The farm has plenty of room for a little boy to run around. They walked out of the courthouse together, 3 generations of women, stepping out of the shadows and into the sun. Behind them, the ruins of Richard Sterling's empire crumbled into dust, a testament to the fact that the most dangerous thing in the world is not a man with power, but a mother with a plan. And that is how Richard Sterling learned the hard way: never underestimate a quiet woman, and never mess with her mother. He thought Sarah was weak because she was silent, but he forgot that silence is where the storm gathers. In the end, Sarah didn't just win a divorce. She gained a sister in Cassidy. She saved a child, and she rediscovered the unbreakable strength of her own family. It's a powerful reminder that no matter how trapped you feel, there is always a way out, especially when you have the truth on your side. I hope this story kept you on the edge of your seat. If you enjoyed seeing justice served cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Share this video with a friend who needs a reminder of their own strength, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. We post real-life drama every single week. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.